Welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to be talking about the basics of the priest decks. We'll start with Circle of Healing. Circle of Healing is a zero-cost spell that restores 4 health to all minions, not including enemy minions. It is a very large AoE heal. This is a great combination with any sort of spell that triggers off heals, like drawing cards off heals. You can also turn it into a big AoE damage if you have spells that turn your healing into damage as well. So it's a pretty universal card. Silence. Silence a minion. Zero cost, silencing a single minion. Very useful. Silence is a very powerful ability, being able to disable and remove enchantments from any sort of minion is a very powerful card. So usually I recommend having at least 1 or 2 silences in any deck, just because it'll save your hide every once in a while. Holy Smite. 1 damage for 1 mana for 2 damage. Standard basic card for damage. Always useful to have in any sort of spell focused deck. If you have any sort of spell power buff cards, it'll obviously increase its damage. Inner Fire. Inner Fire is an interesting card. You could change the attack to be equivalent to its HP. Very powerful if you're using it on minions who have really high HP. You can also use it kind of defensively. If the enemy has a very powerful minion but has very low hit points, you could switch its low hit points to its attack, meaning you can turn, let's say, a 5-1 into a 1-1 or something like that. So it can be useful in both ways. Mind Vision. Mind Vision is an interesting card. For 1 mana, you can copy a random card in an opponent's hand. If you use it early on, I find you usually get low-cost cards, and if you use it a little bit in mid-game or later on, you usually get some of the more powerful cards. I find players seem to waste this card right away by using it early on and getting not as useful cards when they could save it a little bit longer and get a little bit more powerful cards to decimate the player. Power Word Shield. This is an interesting buff card. Giving a minion +2 health and drawing a card is a really good deal for only 1 mana. I usually recommend having this in almost every single priest deck because it will not only help your creatures live a little bit longer, but you get to draw a card. And it's hard to complain for that kind of mana cost. Northshire Cleric. Whenever a minion is healed, draw a card. Now this also triggers whenever an enemy minion is healed, so you can use it in great combination with let's say you're playing against a shaman and the shaman has a healing totem. You can continuously draw a card whenever that healing totem heals one of his minions. So it's a pretty interesting combination. The only drawback with the Northshire Cleric I find is they get killed rather quickly, so you really kind of want to play this one strategically. Divine Spirit. Double a minion's health. Doubling a minion's health is extremely useful on high hit point minions. I usually recommend using it on minions who have a strange number of hit points. Low level minions that have, let's say, 3 hit points, or any minion that has 4, 5, 6, 7 hit points. I find it useful on. Using it on a minion that has 1 or 2 hit points, I don't find it's worth its bang. It can sometimes help you, but usually in the long run it doesn't really do too much. Mind Blast. 2 mana for 5 damage to the enemy hero. This is really good in one of those spell blast decks where you're basically just trying to blast down the enemy hero as quickly as possible. You can almost not go wrong with its mana cost. 2 mana for 5 damage. Hard to go wrong with that spell in those kind of decks. Shadow Word Pain and Shadow Word Death. These are 2 interesting cards. Shadow Word Pain destroys any minion with 3 or less attack power, and Shadow Word Death destroys any minion with 5 or more. The only negative is if you have enemies that are always playing 4 power well, 4 attack power minions, you're not going to be able to kill them. You need something to either buff that minion or reduce its attack power. So these cards are powerful, being able to destroy almost anything, but also limited in the fact that if you're stuck against a 4 power attack deck, you are almost useless with these cards. Thought Steal. Thought Steal is a really good card because you could copy 2 cards from the opponent's deck and put them right into your hand. I don't think I've ever been able to use this card incorrectly. Every single time I use it, I always get something useful from the opponent. And because it's for 3 mana, it's relatively inexpensive as you get more into the mid game and late game. And I usually recommend having at least 1, maybe 2 in most priest decks, just because it's like drawing 2 cards, except you're not wasting your deck. You're getting random cards out of the opponent's deck. Light Spawn. Light Spawn is a very powerful minion, but it has its drawbacks. It's a 4/0/5, but its hit points, its attack power is always equal to its hit points. So it technically turns out to be a 5/5 when it comes into play. Now, anytime it takes damage, it also loses its attack power. Every time it gets healed, it gains attack power. If you buff a hit point, it gains more attack power. This card can be extremely powerful or extremely useless depending on what you're fighting against. This is one of those few cards that do not get affected by lowering attack power spells. So if this thing gets targeted by something now, oh, let's lower its attack power to 1 or something like that, it does not get affected. But if it gets hit by something that lowers its hit points to 1, then it is back down to a 1/1 instead. With that said, what else was there to say about that one? I think that's really about it with this particular card. You really just got to watch out for silent spells and then cards that lowered hit points, like a Hunter's Mark, for instance, will bring it down to a 1 hit point unit. Some of the Paladin spells as well. So it can be very deadly. I usually recommend, in most priest decks, you want to have probably 1 or 2 of these, just because they are a very powerful card. Holy Nova. This is a priest's answer to rush decks. Any Murloc rush deck or other cards, this card will decimate those. Dealing 2 damage to all the enemies and restoring 2 health to all friendly creatures is a very nice bonus. It is a little costly for its ability though, 5 mana. So it takes a little bit extra turn before you can actually play it. But it is always recommended to have at least 1 or 2 of these in any priest deck, just because you want to get rid of those rush decks. Temple Enforcer. Give a friendly minion +3 health. This is really good if you're going to be focusing on a health buff deck. I usually recommend having 1 or 2 of these in those kind of decks, especially if you're combining it with the Light Spawn or something like that. And 6 mana for a 6/6, there's no negative to that card. Mind Control. Mind Control is one of those interesting cards. This card will either win you the game or make you lose the game depending on what you play it on. It is very costly, 10 mana. They recently increased it from 8 mana to 10 mana because there was a lot of complaints about it. So now I think it is more balanced, but it is still one of those cards that you'll either win the game with it or you'll lose the game with it. So I usually, depending on the priest deck you're playing, probably have 1 of them in there. Having 2 would be just a little overkill, I find. Alright, let's now talk about some of the rarer cards. Where are the rare cards? Mass Dispel. Silence all enemy minions and draw a card for 4 mana. So Since Silence is very powerful, this is actually a pretty good spell to have in your deck. It is a little costly at 4, but it does take care of every single minion and gives you a card. So depending on the deck you're playing, I usually recommend having one of these, maybe 2 of these in your deck. Shadow Madness. Gain control of any minion with 3 or less attack until the end of the turn. Because its cost is only 4, you're most likely going to be facing most of the minions that are on the board as 3 or less attack. So you can, at turn 4, take over one of his minions and wipe out one of his others or deal him damage and such. So it is a decent spell for its cost. I find usually in late game it's not as useful, but if you get it early on, it can turn the game around for you. I can't pronounce this first word. Soul Priest. Using your cards and powers that restore hit points now deal damage. This turns your healing spell that the priest has into a 2 damage spell that can be cast on anything. Now you guys just got to remember that it now deals damage. So if you're trying to heal one of your own minions or heal yourself, you're just going to kill it instead. Well, or at least damage it instead. So be very careful with this spell. This spell is this creature is a very interesting creature. Because it has 5 hit points for 4 costs, it lasts a little bit longer than some of the other minions in play at its mana cost. So you can at least get 1 or 2 spells off. Now, this is very powerful. You combine it with some of the creatures that can heal targeted creatures. They can then decimate either the enemy minions or deal a lot of damage directly to the player. So this can be an interesting combination with some of those cards. I've seen a few decks run this. Some of them very successful, and some of them I find they don't last very long. So I think players are still working out a niche to get this card to be really effective. There's probably 1 or 2 more. I'll just have to go into craft mode here. Yes, Light Well. Light Well. At the start of your turn, restore 3 health to a damage-friendly character. 2 mana for a 0/5. This combined with the ability to increase its to change its hit points to damage is almost a must in any sort of deck that's going to be based on buffing and healing. This card is really difficult to kill because of its hit points at early on, so it can be a very powerful card to have in any sort of priest deck. I believe this is the other one. Holy Fire. Deal 5 damage and then restore 5 damage to the heal. This could wipe out any sort of minion that's really annoying, or you could finish off a player or just hurt a player to give yourself hit points. Very good card. For its mana cost and damage ratio, I usually recommend having 1 spell power card to make it a little bit more equal in damage, but still, 5 damage for 5 hit points, you cannot go wrong with that card. If you can get your hands on it, usually probably have 1 of these cards in your deck, especially if you're running some sort of damage spell deck or something like that. I believe that's everything for the priest deck. Thank you for joining me, and if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to post them, and thank you for watching my video.